All right, welcome to Becky Live. Our topic today is complexity of thinking. I'm happy to have you here today, and this is an opportunity for us just to explore different ways of how research maybe kind of impacts or can be brought into the ways in which we kind of live our lives. So today we're going to be covering a multitude of things. We're going to be talking about complexity, how we make sense of it currently, and kind of how HR tries to help support leaders and being able to handle that and develop that. I'm going to then talk specifically about what complexity of thinking is. So this term gets thrown out a lot. I even hear things like complex thinking or complexly thinking. And I think there are different ways in which it's described. So I'm going to describe to you what it means for me and kind of what research tradition it comes out of. I'm going to talk to you about how you measure it. And I'm also going to talk about how do you develop it and some ways in which I go about doing that. And then lastly, I'll end with some good places to start. All right. So before I jump into our agenda today, a little bit about me. So I'm Becky Andree. I'm the CEO of Vertical Leadership Consulting. I started the company because I was concerned about how leadership development was being done. I was concerned that it was too heavily focused on content and not enough on context. And interestingly enough, Deloitte, McKinsey, a few other big consulting firms have come out with some research that they're pretty much aligned with me in that thinking. But I do see like there is a struggle and a shift for HR and training and leadership development professionals to make this leap. So today I want to kind of talk about that. But that's really why I started Vertical Leadership Consulting. I work mainly with small to medium-sized companies to help them activate potential within their organization, make sure they have strong succession pipelines, make sure that they're challenging and developing the thinking and leveraging the tensions in their organizations to develop that. On a personal level, I live in Michigan. I am a mom to a teenager, so I have some daily growth edges for me as an individual where I experience volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity on an ongoing basis. So let's get started. So I'm going to be talking about this from a talent perspective. All right. And one of the big challenges that we have is trying to create these collectives, these organizations, these companies that actually allow us to thrive, flourish, and tackle some of the challenges that we have going on. All right. And typically that work has been left mainly with HR. I'm starting to see some of a shift where it's now that ownership is also with the leadership. But it really is about how do we take that talent and how do we make sure that we're developing it appropriately. So that's kind of the lens I'm going to take today. So how do we make sense of complexity? Well, we take a look at how we kind of define complexity of work. And this is beginning to shift and change as we move into more digitalization and automation. But it still kind of boils down to these things where we look at financial, kind of what is the scope. And we seem to understand that there's a difference in complexity when you're dealing with 1 million versus 100 million versus a billion versus a trillion. We take a look at kind of markets, industries, and even technical aspects where we understand that different markets, industries, and technical aspects have different complexities to them. It's very different to, I've been experienced in manufacturing. It's very different to manufacture an automotive spring than it is an airfoil that or a blade, air blade that's going to go in an engine in a airplane. Those are two very different things and have different specifications. So there's different complexity to it. We also take a look at kind of the number of employees. How many direct reports do we have? What's that number? What's their levels? How many levels are you responsible for in the organization? We also look at what do you need to know, or what experience do you need to have in order to do the work? All right. And, we wouldn't hire someone that has a degree in social work to be doing engineering specs for airplane engine parts. All right. And so we seem to have this sense that you do need to have this knowledge or experience in these areas. We also look at competencies and behaviors. So what do we need people to do in the particular context and space in which we're in? And those are different, competencies and behaviors, although there are some consistencies across industries, there are a lot of nuances to it. It looks very different in a healthcare versus what it looks like on a manufacturing floor. And so this context and this complexity matters. And so, I've been embedded in HR. I still work with HR departments. And HR kind of makes sense of this complexity of work and tries to help support in these different ways. So we have some pretty robust compensation structures that look at scope and breadth of a job and why should we pay different things to different people. We look at high potential or development programs where we're looking to identify potential in individuals and then looking to develop and build their capabilities. We create competency structures where we look at what behaviors are necessary to be successful for thriving and flourishing. And sometimes we even add levels in. So for a larger organization, we might explain how that behavior looks maybe at an individual contributor level versus a manager level versus an executive level. And then I see career pathing where we have kind of these years that maybe you need to be doing something, these different functions you have to be in, or these experiences, all right? And so all of these items really help us make sense of this complexity of work that we're facing. So we've got a good start, all right? But we also know that it's not activating everything that it needs to activate. And in fact, I'm looking forward to hearing Colin's view when we get to Q&A, because there's some, the way we've structured things have created some really bad things. But what we've done in HR is only focus on skill development. All right. And when I talk about skill development, this is really content. All right. Focusing on what you know. So what knowledge do you have? What skills do you have? What competencies do you have? What behaviors look like? And in all of these structures of support that HR has, it's all about increasing the content, increasing the skill development, increasing your knowledge, increasing your skills. But that is only one part of the equation. There is another part, and your leaders intuitively know this. I'm going to get to that in a second. But it's what is complexity of thinking. And so for each job, there are different cognitive complexity demands, right? So it looks very different to be an executive of a manufacturing company versus an executive of a technology software firm. There are different complexity demands that are required of you, or an executive at a science-driven or research-driven company. And so we have to understand that each job, even at the executive level, all the way down to even just being a dishwasher at a restaurant, all of these have a cognitive complexity demand to them. And what we need to do is match it to the individual's cognitive complexity capabilities. So there's a job demand, and then there's the individual capability. And what we want to do is to have the job demands be just a little bit harder than what the individual's capabilities are, so that we're making use of that tension, so that they are growing and developing and creating some energy and challenging. All right. So when I talk about complexity of thinking, it's not about, oh, everybody needs to be complex thinkers. No, it's about creating this match. All right. And I'm going to talk further about that throughout our time together. But I heard leaders talking about this. So I don't even know how many succession planning or talent discussions I've been involved in. I've been involved in a lot. what was interesting is I heard this phenomenon. I mean, leaders already intuitively know this. They're already talking about complexity of thinking. We just haven't given them the structure or the language to be able to make sense of it. But when I went back to get my PhD and I was listening to these succession planning, I was like, oh my gosh, this is what it is. It's the ability to think in context, to be able to think more complexly. So these are the things that I heard. I heard it in two different ways. I heard it in ways that kind of were positive, suggesting that the leader knew that they weren't quite there yet, but they were making movement. I also heard it in ways where leaders described it as being stalled. All right. So in the more positive way, I heard language like they have great potential, all right, which we'll talk about next month, but potential isn't even a real thing. We actually all have potential. But to me, the potential was really they were continually leaning into being able to handle complexity, the demands of the job, right? I also heard them talk about a big jump. It's a big jump to go from manager to director. They're not quite ready for that yet. And so they almost intuitively knew that it wasn't just about what they knew, it was that they couldn't cognitively handle the complexity of that job. I heard things like growing up. Yeah, she's doing great, but she's 25 years old. She's got some growing up to do before she's ready for a director level. So this sense that it also takes some time, like this isn't something that you just go to a class and learn. All right. And then I heard things where it was more stalled, where I would hear language like they're in over their heads. All right. We moved them into a director role. They're still trying to figure out the director role. We can't talk about upward mobility yet. We've got to see if they can figure out this director level, almost this sense that we knew that they were wrestling with these cognitive complexity demands. I heard things that would suggest that someone went from a hero to a zero. So I would hear things like, yeah, they were great at the manager role. I don't know what happened. Like they are failing as a director. And so we almost promoted them maybe too soon, or promoted them into an environment that didn't provide the support, or the gap was too big between the job demands versus the individual capabilities. And so they go from this hero to zero. All right. And we're kind of left scratching our head. We know it's happening, but we don't know why. And then the last one I would hear is they've reached their ceiling. Yeah, nope. They're doing great as a VP, but they don't have the capability to be a CEO. Or I would hear, they're a great supervisor, but they don't have the ability to become a manager. All right, almost suggesting that their development had tapped out. And really, to me, those things that were stalled were really just indicating we're not seeing them grow in their cognitive complexity, or we're seeing gaps, right? And so these are the things that I heard that really supported this need to move into developing complexity of thinking, or to help them put things into context. And it really is this thinking development. It's not just what you know, but how you think about what you know, your advanced thinking capabilities. There are differences in thinking around decision making, around being self-aware within specific domains, within reflective judgment, all right? And these later levels aren't necessarily better, all right? They're just different. And if in certain circumstances, they may be necessary and required. All right. And it's about increasing your ability to handle complexity. So moving beyond these single models. And you can probably think about that leader who went through an MBA program and comes in with a single model and says, this is going to solve all our problems. All right. That is an indication of their complexity of thinking. There's nothing wrong with that, but they also need to begin to see, be able to critique it, be able to begin to loosen attachment to that. And then later on, in advanced kind of leadership positions, they need to be able to combine different models together, right, to create something new, right? So this thinking development, our leaders are already talking about it. And so we just need to add to it. We need to give them the language. Now, there's been some recent marketing out there. Oh, we just add on vertical development. Well, it's already there. All right. All of those HR structures and support that I talked about, you already have it in there. You're just maybe not leveraging or using it. or creating situations to be able to accelerate that development. So it's not necessarily not about adding it on. What I might agree with is that HR needs to add on their knowing about complexity of thinking so that they can make use of these structures that you have and use them in more nuanced ways to activate this. So what do I mean about thinking capabilities? So this is just a concrete example, very simplistic way of thinking about it, about how thinking changes from early stages of thinking capabilities to later stages. All right. So early on, we focus on someone to blame and we think nothing can be done. All right. Then we move on to we need an expert. We develop a process. Then we move on to what do we know, looking at a range of options. And lastly, we look at how might we be wrong, which allows for emergence, right? And different leadership levels require different things, right? So someone to blame, nothing can be done. We hope that early adult, especially their families and their communities, have put some pressure on that so that they move beyond that. Mainly, we see leaders who are in, some are in the someone to blame, nothing can be done. But, most of them are starting to get into this, we need an expert, develop a process, and then throughout continue to develop into those other areas potentially throughout their career. So how do I measure complexity of thinking? Well, I use Lectica's assessments. So they have a couple of different options. The one that I use most often is the leader decision-making assessment. And I found that it's most relevant and helpful for leaders because they're making decisions every day, and it's in the decisions where the complexity is. And so we can work on those decision-making skills without being too complicated or complex about complexity of thinking. Like they don't even realize they're working on it. But the Lectica assessment measures these different levels. So it measures, is someone thinking in an advanced linear way? So are they thinking more black and white and linear? Are they able to begin to move into early systems thinking where they're starting to see very simple systems? Are they moving into advanced systems thinking where they can now see the webs and these highly complex interdependencies? Or are they moving into early principled thinking where they can describe something in an elegantly simple way? It's highly complex, but they understand it so deeply that they can explain it in a way that is understandable to anyone at any kind of thinking level. And so if we think about the previous examples that I gave you, this is kind of where they fall, all right? You can see they kind of overlap. All right. And so some of the interventions that we do that focus more on kind of these rough structures can be helpful, right? But they don't always accelerate. Sometimes there's a lot of angst or difficulty for leaders in moving with these spaces because there's a lot of translation that needs to happen. With the Lectica assessment, what I really appreciate is it makes it very concrete for them. So it tells them, are you in A, B, C, or D? And it in black and white shows them, what is your thinking around decision making? What is it now and what's emerging? And so it automatically shows that growth edge. Remember, I talked about you have to have that right match. The assessment automatically shows them and the coach or the consultant where that growth edge and where to go. And it shows it in multiple different ways. And so for me, when I'm working with a leader, I'm listening to where they're motivated to go because it doesn't really matter. All right. So it measures their clarity. How clear are you in your arguments? It measures perspective coordination. What perspectives do you consider and how do you coordinate them? It measures collaborative capacity. How do you work with others and what do you consider? It looks at contextual thinking. How do you frame things when you're making decisions? And then it looks at your decision-making skills. So there are 5 areas, all right, where it's showing in black and white. Here's how you're thinking about it now. Here's where you're emerging into something. And it allows that growth edge. And I can find that area where someone's like, oh, I'm really interested in contextual thinking. And so then all the learning is just focused in that area, right? And so these different areas, this A, B, C, and D are very different, right? In A, they're all about collecting information so that they can provide a direction to others. In B, they're using that information to understand the situation and to frame the problem better, right? Or to frame how the team is looking at it. In C, they're looking at using the information to find context and options. So now it's not just about finding the one ideal, it's really about saying, okay, we have three options here and looking at the pros and cons and the context of those pros and cons. And then as they move into the advanced systems thinking, they're able to look at this information and all of this complexity as aligning. All right, so how do we create better alignment? And they're also able to understand the limits of each perspective so that they begin to look at what perspectives do we need to look at in order to see the whole. All right. And so you can begin to see at different leadership levels, there would be different demands and different needs that you might have. All right. At a supervisor level, 11 or early system thinking A is totally fine. We need them collecting information in order to make a decision for direction. At a manager level, we need them to understand and be looking at framing the problem. At a director or VP level, we need them to be able to be looking at some options and context. And at the executive or CEO level, we definitely need them looking at alignment and seeing the whole. All right. And so this is the tool that I use to measure, to find that growth edge, and to develop them most effectively. Now, I want to situate kind of complexity of thinking in all of this noise. All right. So I kind of think about it in three separate buckets. When you think about the vendors that you select and choose, if you're in HR or talent, these are the different things that you're going to hear. You're going to hear neuroscience, we're brain-based, but neuroscience is really the mechanics, all right? The mechanics of how the brain operates. And this is still a very new field, all right? In fact, I just read an article that some neuroscientists are quite perplexed because they thought emotions were only in one part of the brain. And what they're finding is emotions drift, all right? So happy might show up in one part of the brain one day, and 3 months later, it's in a completely different part of the brain. And they can't describe it yet. They don't know why that drift happens. So there's still things that are emerging. We look at behavior. So our approaches and processes, how do we interact with each other, right? And then we think about cognitive, which is really about this sense making and how we think. And so we're starting to see kind of some emerging vendors or some emerging approaches that are attempting to combine these. I still see about, I would still say probably 95% are still primarily focused on this behavior, which is content. All right. And they'll say that they're brain-based, but when you dig into it and ask a lot of questions beyond the slick marketing brochure, it's just they took one neuroscience component, added it to the program, and now they're brain-based, which, okay, maybe it's a little bit better than it was before, but it still isn't completely brain-based. All right. So we have to be really kind of aware of the people that fall in this space. All right. We see things like the Neuro Leadership Institute, which does a really great job of taking the research from neuroscience and behavior and combining it together and providing a pathway forward. But it still only looks at those two components. We're starting to see sense making, a lot of tools and approaches coming out that look at sense making and that do pull in some behaviors and some neuroscience into that as well. And then for me, the Lectica, what I have experienced and when I've looked into their research and even in my PhD research with complexity of thinking is looking at how does this show up? How do we make sense? How do we think about things, not only from the mechanics of the brain, but also in the behavior approaches and processes. So it kind of looks across all of these. And so I'm really excited about some of the emerging things that we're seeing. I think we're going to see a lot more explode in the next 15 years. And I think we're going to, maybe in the next 5 years, start to see HR departments being part of that explosion, being part of that experimentation. But I think we're still really limited in the HR departments being interested in that and moving into that space. They still are, in my opinion, pretty wedded to the behavior, a little bit to the neuroscience, but mainly to the behavior. So I want to just leave us with just some understanding of complexity of thinking. It really is the brain's operating system. It's how you make sense of things, and your capabilities are limited by what you see and how you think. All right. Now, I use the word limited, but this is not necessarily a bad thing. All right. Because again, we want that match, right, between the job demands and the individual capabilities. And I just want to share a quick story with you. So about a year ago, as I was writing up my concept paper for my PhD research, I came across a really big problem. All right. The two research strains that I was trying to bring together fundamentally believed different things. In the academic world, it's called epistemologies. And I was looking at this and I was like, oh my goodness, how did I not know this? How did I not notice this? This is a huge deal. I don't know how I'm going to resolve this. So I sat down with my son, who at the time was 15, and he's a little annoyed at how long it's taking mom to finish her PhD. And so I sat him down and said, hey, I just need to let you know, I've come across this really big problem. It's probably going to take me longer to finish the PhD than I originally thought. I'm so sorry, but like I can't move forward until I resolve this tension. And I just having a hard time seeing how to resolve it. And my son's response was, hell no. You are not going to take more time. I'm done with this. I want my mom back. Which is funny because anyway, I won't even go into that. But anyway, he was like, no, we're going to figure this out. All right. And so I've been talking about my research. And so he started pulling things from the kitchen table and he said, okay, so this is this and this is that and this is this, and said, now explain to me why they don't work together. And so it forced my thinking, right, to translate down into a way that he could understand. And so I explained kind of what the tension was and what I wasn't able to resolve. And then my son just sat there for a few minutes and said, well, Mom, what about X? Wouldn't that bring the two together? And I sat there and I thought, oh my God, it might. All right. And so again, yes, I'm a complex thinker, but I was embedded in this complexity and I couldn't pull out of it. Right. And someone who was limited could see something that I couldn't see. Right. And so I just really want to reinforce that it isn't about getting to these later stages. It's about kind of creating these opportunities for these things to come together and to allow people to be in what they can see and how they can think, and for us to use those differences to keep us moving forward. All right. So it's not about just reaching this end level. It's also important to know that it's domain specific. All right. And I see this happen a lot in the healthcare field. You have individuals who have deep, complex thinking in the medical domain, and then you see them struggling in leadership positions, right? Because they don't have complexity of thinking around decision making in a leadership capacity. They do in a medical domain, right? And so this complexity of thinking is somewhat domain specific. Now, some of the vertical development theories say that you have a center of gravity. I actually believe both are true. I do think you have a center of gravity, and yet there is a domain specificity to it, that if you haven't done deep learning, knowing in that domain, you can't complexly think about it, okay? Complexity of thinking also aligns with the brain functioning, and our brain actually prefers to learn. So it finds these growth edges, these micro movements, all right, that are very tiny, all right, but make a big difference in our complexity of thinking. And I feel like that's where our content or our skills and behaviors are lacking, is that, we just think it's just this one growth edge. It's just about knowing it. No, it's about working with it more complexly. So we have to create these activities and these interventions that allow for a range of people to be getting the challenges out of them. And the other thing is that it takes time. So to move a level can take a decade, all right? If it happens at all right? In order for complexity of thinking to move, we have to be challenged. We have to be in an environment that is supporting us, and we have to be kind of doing this iterative application of it, all right? And when we introduce an intervention like the Lectica assessment, it helps movement happen faster because people don't have to figure out the growth edge. We just lean right into that growth edge. So I can usually take a leader in a level, a thinking level, in about less than 3 years. Fastest has been 18 months up to about 3 years versus a decade, but it helps kind of move things a little bit faster. So what have been the results of adding complexity of thinking? Well, this is what I have seen, not only with the individual leaders I've worked with, but also with the organizations that I've worked with, is that it is really activating a lot of things. It's creating energy. People are being challenged. It's activating curiosity. You're seeing movement. You're seeing potential being activated. Someone who maybe leaders didn't see potential in before are now seeing it. You're seeing inclusion. My clients are experiencing financial results. You see optimism. You see better connections happening with people. So I've seen a lot of great things happening when we focus on complexity of thinking. And again, a lot of our structures that we already have in HR, we just have to add that next component and look at how do we leverage that to activate complexity of thinking. So some good places to start if you want to measure complexity of thinking is when you're doing executive recruitment. Their decision making has really broad implications throughout the organization. So you can assess their decision making capabilities and see exactly what they're thinking complexity is. Succession planning is also a good place, looking at critical positions where you use the leader decision-making assessment to focus and accelerate development in their work. All right, so everything we do gets embedded in the work that they're doing. You can create curriculums around it as well if you're a larger organization looking to activate the collective. Team effectiveness, using the LDMA to assess capabilities and issues. You can look at leader development for early career, all right? One of the things that I love about complexity of thinking is you start to get them doing robust learning. So you don't need an assessment. You just need to activate it early on. So they're looking at every experience and every learning opportunity as a way to challenge their thinking and get and just activate it throughout the organization. So it just becomes a normal part of it. And then the compensation structure, really defining those cognitive complexity demands at each level. You can actually define that so that it's really clear. So that's a little bit about complexity of thinking. Before we get into questions and answers, just want to tell you I have some upcoming events if you're interested in hearing more. I am talking in Forum, Michigan on September 9th. We're going to be talking about developing early career professionals. So I'm going to be talking about how to activate complexity of thinking through a formula to get them on the right path for their entire career. On September 17th for Becky Live, I'll be talking about potential, what it is, and how to activate it. In October, I'll be talking about connections. How do we create connections that are energizing versus draining? I'm doing a live Disrupt HR in Lansing if you're local to Michigan. And I haven't established a date for EQ Labs, but I'm going to be talking again in the third quarter. I think Dr. Clayton wanted me to talk about complexity of thinking for leaders. So we'll focus in on that. And then my Becky Live in November 12th, I'll be talking about tension and how to use it. So I want to thank all of you for being here with me today and letting me share a little bit of my thoughts on complexity of thinking. If you want to get in touch with me, here's the best way. I would also encourage you to go to LinkedIn, connect with me, follow me, sign up for the newsletter so that you know about upcoming events and can keep track of kind of how I'm thinking about things. Is a great way. And I do try to post things as well on LinkedIn about what I'm thinking or interesting research articles that I'm seeing come out. So with that, I'm going to stop the recording.